You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.
Hi everyone, this is John Mandrola from theheart.org Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for December 8th, 2017. This week, I'm talking mobile ECG, PFO closure and migraines, cardiology care of AFib, VTE therapy, and PCSK9 inhibition. The first topic is that big news in mobile health came out last week. First, the FDA has cleared a new ECG sensor for the Apple Watch. It's called the Cardia Band, and it allows people to record a single lead ECG from their watch, and that is surely a pretty cool thing. This is an advance over other wrist devices such as a Fitbit or Garmin that use PPG technology to detect only the pulse rate. The Cardia Band, similar to the AliveCore attachment to the iPhone, lets you see the actual single-lead ECG. Now perhaps the bigger news was that Apple announced its entry into cardiac research with the Apple Heart Study. In partnership with Stanford researchers, the study will collect Apple Watch ECG recordings from people who volunteer to share their data. The goal, obviously, is to learn more about AF and potentially reduce the burden of stroke. Getting Apple interested in cardiology is a big deal. There's a ton of enthusiasm for this new technology. I'm not completely sold on the idea that all this rhythm monitoring is going to end up being a good thing. What's crazy is that on Twitter, at least, it's become hard to be anything but enthusiastic on this topic. Even the businessman Mark Cuban chimed in on my Twitter timeline to say how the device has helped him. I wrote a column on this topic that's coming out today. I hope it generates some conversation and commentary. Next topic is PFO and migraines. Another sham-controlled trial has made news in cardiology, and this one addressed the question of PFO closure for migraines. Observational trials have suggested PFO closure may indeed reduce migraine headaches, but this relationship did not hold up to scrutiny in the MIST trial, M-I-S-T, which was a sham-controlled trial of PFO closure using the older Starflex device. Though it was negative, that trial was criticized as having total cessation of headache as a primary endpoint, and also experts questioned the effectiveness of the early generation PFO closure device. A more recent trial called the PRIMA trial, P-R-I-M-A trial, studied 107 patients with migraine and found PFO closure did reduce the number of migraines with Aura days. However, PRIMA was not a sham-controlled trial. So this most recent trial called PREMIUM trial took 7 years to randomize 230 patients with frequent and multi-drug refractory migraine to PFO closure or sham. And the primary efficacy endpoint, which was a migraine responder rate defined as a 50% reduction in headaches per month, was achieved in 38.5% of patients randomized to the device and 32% of those randomized to control, so about a 6.5% absolute delta, but this failed to achieve statistical superiority. Secondary endpoints were interesting. So subjects in the PFO closure group had a significantly greater reduction in headache days, and complete migraine remission for 1 year occurred in 10 patients in the PFO group, but only 1 in the control group. Again, those were secondary endpoints. Two editorialists raised the possibility that their lower point estimate of the PFO closure and the reduction in secondary endpoints suggest that there may be patients with migraine that respond to. They and the authors called for more study. I recently had a patient like this. He had tons of migraines, had tried all sorts of drugs. He'd been seen in major migraine clinics, and lo and behold, he had a significant PFO on echo that we had done for bradycardia or PVCs or some other reason. I have to admit to thinking of PFO closure and wondering whether he might be one of these people who will respond. You really want to help these people. But the overall data, 2 sham-controlled trials, suggest no benefit. Neither found a difference in their primary endpoints. And you can't say much more about the secondary endpoints because the numbers in these groups are so small. But I agree, the signal in these secondary endpoints and some of the other observational data make me queasy about closing the door completely on more research on this matter. Third topic is cardiology care of atrial fibrillation patients. Now, AF is growing exponentially, everybody agrees. The mobile ECG will only increase the number of humans who interact with the healthcare system due to atrial fib. The question is, who's going to care for all these new patients with AFib? Is any one group doing better than another? And Canadian investigators tested the association between cardiologist care and clinical outcomes in patients admitted to an emergency department in Ontario. Now, this was a retrospective population-level observational study that used propensity matching. Now, I'll put in parentheses here that just these words should raise your caution meter. In this study, one group of patients with AF saw a cardiologist in the year after admission. This represented 85% of one of the comparison groups. The other 15% saw internist or family docs. The authors did their best to propensity match. In other words, they tried to make the unrandomized groups similar. And you can guess how the results came out. Cardiology care, of course, was associated with a 32% lower rate of death. An absolute difference was only 2.4%. Now, the weird thing about these results was that all the other outcomes were worse in the cardiology care group. The cardiology care group had a higher incidence of strokes, bleeding, and heart failure. And cardiology care did a lot more stuff, too. They did more echoes, nuclears, and CAS. The observations from this study are similar to the TREAT AF observational study, which was published earlier this year, which also found cardiology care did better. Now, my comments here are that it's plausible that cardiologists do better with AF care, but these sorts of analysis are flawed to the gills. The authors lay these issues out. The unmeasured confounding is a big deal. The lack of data on the cause of death here, for instance, and also, obviously, the lack of randomization of groups. I don't think you can say much about who does better. But cardiologists should keep in mind that there has been an RCT of who delivers the best AF care, and they lost mightily in this trial to nurses armed with computers and algorithms. A group of investigators from the Netherlands, led by Dr. Jeroen Hendricks, this study was published in the European Heart Journal. These authors showed that in an RCT of more than 700 patients, a whopping 6% reduction in a composite endpoint of CV hospitalizations and CV death with nurse-led care versus standard cardiology care. This RCT that showed nurse-led care for AFib is one of my favorites of all time, and I'll put a link to it underneath the podcast. Next topic concerns mechanical and lytic therapy for large, deep venous thrombosis in an effort to prevent leg swelling, post-thrombotic syndrome. Now, I want to start this story off with this beautiful quote, one in which you can substitute many other therapies thought to work but did not pass muster in an RCT. And this is from the news story on this topic. The quote is this, quote, "Many physicians who do the procedure have come to believe that it works in terms of preventing longer-term problems. This time, it is the pharmacomechanical catheter-directed thrombolysis for the prevention of post-thrombotic syndrome in patients with DVT. This was a multi-center RCT published in the New England Journal, and it compared standard anticoagulation regimens with the thrombolytic and mechanical procedure. They had about 350 patients in each group, and there was absolutely no difference in the primary outcome. None. There was no difference in quality of life at 24 months. There was, however, a significantly higher rate of major bleeding in the first 10 days in the group that got mechanical and lytic therapy. Yes, some of the surrogate measures and secondary outcomes favored the intervention group, leading some advocates to posit that there may be some patients who benefit. In other words, some heterogeneous treatment effect. And we can't exclude that, but this trial should help prevent many patients from undergoing unnecessary interventional procedures. And again, I think it's fair to say we learn a ton from studies like this, not just in the specific area here of VTE management, but more importantly, the notion that just because we do a procedure and think it works does not make it so. Last topic is evolocumab, PCSK9 inhibition. Before a recent priority review, the FDA had approved evolocumab for use in addition to diet and maximally tolerated statin therapy in adults with familial hypercholesterolemia or clinical evidence of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease who require further LDL cholesterol lowering. But now, recently, the FDA has approved evolocumab to prevent MI, stroke, and coronary vascularization in adults with established cardiovascular disease. This is basically the 4-year study population. The FDA also approved evolocumab as an adjunct to diet alone or in combination with other lipid-lowering therapies for the treatment of adults with primary hyperlipidemia to reduce LDL cholesterol. Now, it's worth a brief mention on Fourier. This was a 27,000 patient study that resulted in only a 1.5% absolute reduction in a composite endpoint. There was no reduction in CV death, no reduction in overall death, and most of the benefit in the primary endpoint came in reduction of non-fatal MI and revascularizations. Of note, though, the Kaplan-Meier curves did appear to be separating more as time went on, so it's possible and likely even that longer exposure to lower LDL levels reduces cardiovascular events even more. But gosh, this is quite a small benefit for such an expensive drug. And since the trial was stopped at 3 years, we really won't have good knowledge of long-term side effects of having such low cholesterol numbers. So that's it for This Week in Cardiology. I'm grateful that you listened. Thank you. This is John Mandrola from the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from the Heart.org on Medscape.